My name is Daniel Prescott, 29 years old, single. I'm a lawyer trying to carve out a place for myself in the relentless hustle of Boston, Massachusetts. I live in a small rented apartment on the 5th floor of an old building, where the smell of toasted bread from the bakery downstairs wafts through every morning. The apartment is nothing special: a worn-out sofa, a desk buried under papers, and a bookshelf filled with law books I rarely touch anymore. But I don't complain. This is the life I chose, the path I charted when I left Newport, Rhode Island, the place where I was born, raised, and where memories of my family cling to me like the salty breath of the sea. Newport isn't just my hometown, it's a part of my very being. The cobblestone streets, the winds from Narragansett Bay, and the grand old mansions from the Gilded Age, they all shaped my childhood. Our family home, a $1 million mansion, sat on a tree-lined street shaded by oaks. That's where I used to run around on the lawn, listen to my mother's lullabies, and hold her hand as we strolled along the shore. My mother, with her warm smile and ocean blue eyes, left me when I was just 6 years old. Cancer came swiftly, taking her before I could even grasp what loss meant. All that remains are fragmented memories: her voice, the scent of her perfume, and the feeling of my small hand nestled in hers. My father, Samuel Prescott, was a stern but deeply loving man. He ran an investment fund founded by my grandfather, a financial legacy spanning 3 generations, filled with stories of ingenuity, perseverance, and near bankruptcies. My father never boasted about his work, but he always took pride in our family. "Daniel," he would say, his voice deep and steady, "money can vanish, but family is forever." As a child, I didn't fully grasp the weight of those words, but they've stayed with me, etched into my heart like a lifelong lesson. My father owned an antique Rolex, an heirloom passed down from my grandfather. That watch was more than an expensive object. It was a symbol of the Prescott family. Its stainless steel case had aged over time. The glossy black dial with its delicate hands and the worn leather strap still exuded elegance. My father only wore it on special occasions: a significant gala, an event for the investment fund, or simply when he wanted to remind me of our roots. "One day, Daniel," he once said, his eyes gleaming, "this watch will be yours. It doesn't just tell time, it carries our family's history." I smiled and nodded, though back then I only saw it as a beautiful object. Now I understand it's a thread connecting me to my father, my grandfather, and the generations before them. Our family wasn't just my father and me. After my mother's death, my father remarried Linda when I was 7. Linda was a distant woman, not malicious, but there was always an invisible wall between us. Along with Linda came Jacob, my half-brother, the son of my father and Linda. 8 years younger than me, Jacob was a bright kid, but always looked at me with wary eyes as if I were a stranger in my own home. I didn't blame him. When Linda and Jacob entered our lives, I was too young to fully understand the complexities of family, but old enough to feel the shift in the air. My father tried to keep things balanced. He still hugged me, told me stories about my grandfather, and taught me how to tie my shoes. But Linda and Jacob made me feel like I didn't quite belong. Family dinners always left me uneasy. My father sat at the head of the table asking about my schoolwork or sharing stories from his youth. Linda would smile, but her smile was cold, as if she were merely playing a role. Jacob was quiet, only glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. Once I caught him holding my father's Rolex, examining it with a mix of curiosity and longing. "Don't touch it," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Jacob shrugged, put the watch down, but his eyes seemed to challenge me. "You'll see." That moment unsettled me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Perhaps it was the undercurrent of rivalry, a gap that Jacob and Linda never tried to bridge. At 18, I left Newport to attend college in Boston. I wanted to escape the shadow of Linda and Jacob, to build a life of my own. My father supported me, though I could see the sadness in his eyes. He handed me the keys to his 1965 Mustang, smiled, and said, "Your path, Daniel." Go, but don't forget your roots. I hugged him, promising to visit often. But life has a way of pulling you off course. College, law school, then long days at a law firm. I got swept up in the grind, only calling my father a few times a month. Trips back to Newport became rare, and whenever I called, Linda was often the one to answer. Your father's fine, Daniel. Focus on your career, she'd say, her voice sweet but cold. I wanted to hear my father's voice, but she always steered the conversation elsewhere or said he was busy. Once I heard his voice in the background faint, as if he were trying to say something. But Linda quickly cut in. He's resting, Daniel. Next time, okay? Something felt off, but I brushed it aside. I was busy. I trusted her. And I was wrong. Boston became my home, but not a place where I felt I belonged. My work as a lawyer consumed most of my time. I worked for a small law firm, fighting every day to prove myself. Cases, late nights, drafting contracts, tense meetings. They all made me lose sight of what mattered more. I told myself I'd visit my father, call him more often, but I kept getting pulled into a new case, a new deadline. I didn't know that back in Newport, my father was facing a challenge far greater than anything I could imagine. A challenge I only discovered when it was too late. The Rolex has always lingered in my mind. My father said he'd leave it to me, not for its material value, but because it was a bond between us, between me and my grandfather, between me and the generations before. I don't wear watches often. I'm not one for flaunting, but whenever I think of it, I feel a warmth in my chest. It's a reminder of my father, of the days he taught me to fish at the harbor, of the times he laughed heartily when I spilled juice on his shirt. I never expected that watch to become the center of a storm about to hit, a storm that would upend my life and reveal secrets I could never have imagined. Everything began on a Tuesday morning as I sat in my law office, surrounded by stacks of papers and a cold cup of coffee. My phone buzzed and I saw Linda's number. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen. Calls from Linda rarely brought good news. Usually she'd call for a perfunctory check-in, her voice sweet but icy, or to assure me that my father was fine. But this time her tone was different, urgent, trembling, as if she were holding something back. Daniel, you need to come to Newport now. Your father, he's not okay. I felt the blood freeze in my veins. Not okay how? I asked, my voice tightening. Linda stammered, mumbling something about my father being ill, that he'd grown very weak, that I should get to the hospital immediately. I don't remember what I said next, only that I grabbed my coat, rushed out of the office, and drove my father's old Mustang to Newport with a mind in turmoil. Questions swirled in my head. My father was sick? Since when? Why hadn't anyone told me sooner? When I arrived at the hospital, the sight of my father shattered my heart. He lay in bed, gaunt, his skin pale, his once bright eyes now cloudy and sunken. A ventilator hummed beside him, a tube running across his mouth. A nurse stood quietly adjusting the equipment. My father couldn't speak, couldn't move, only looked at me with eyes full of pain and regret. I took his hand, feeling his frail fingers try to squeeze back, as if he wanted to say something he no longer had the strength for. Dad, I whispered, tears welling up. I'm here. The doctor pulled me aside and explained that my father had amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a cruel disease that devoured the body bit by bit. He was in the final stages, unable to walk or speak, communicating only through faint nods in his eyes. He's been fighting for nearly 2 years, the doctor said, his voice heavy with sorrow. 2 years. 2 years I knew nothing about. I turned to Linda, who stood in the corner with Jacob, her eyes avoiding mine. Why didn't anyone tell me? I demanded, struggling to contain my anger. Linda pursed her lips and replied, Your father didn't want you to worry. He said you were building your career and shouldn't be distracted. Distracted? I nearly lost my composure. He's my father. Jacob stood behind his mother, silent, but his gaze was sharp, almost defiant. I wanted to press further, to dig into why they'd kept me in the dark. But my father's look from the hospital bed stopped me. He gave a faint nod as if to say, "Not now, Daniel." I swallowed my anger and returned to hold his hand, trying to make the most of the fleeting moments we had left. The weeks that followed were a nightmare. I took a leave of absence, handed off most of my work to colleagues, and spent nearly every moment at the hospital. But every time I visited, Linda or Jacob was there, as if keeping watch. Conversations with my father were brief, limited to moments where I tried to read his intentions through his eyes. I blamed myself endlessly. Why hadn't I visited more often? Why had I let work consume me? The infrequent calls, Linda answering for my father, I'd ignored too many signs. Once I asked my father's private nurse if he'd ever mentioned me. She nodded and whispered, "He always asked about you, but Mrs. Linda said not to bother you." Her words cut like a knife. I began to suspect that Linda and Jacob had deliberately kept me away from my father. But why? I had no answers, only a growing sense of unease, like a dark cloud looming closer. I tried to ask my father, but he was too weak, gazing at me with eyes full of sorrow, as if apologizing. I didn't know what he was sorry for, but I knew I'd failed him as a son. Then one morning, as I arrived at the hospital, the nurse shook her head as I entered the room. My father had passed away in the night, quietly, without a goodbye. I stood there, staring at his motionless body, feeling the world collapse around me. I knelt beside the bed, holding his hand, but it no longer squeezed back. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears falling to the floor. I was sorry for not being there, for not realizing he was fighting alone, for letting Linda and Jacob build a wall between us. The funeral was heavy with tension. Linda and Jacob played the part of the grieving family perfectly, but I couldn't look at them without anger boiling inside me. I wanted to scream, to demand why they hadn't told me sooner, why they'd let my father die alone. But I held back, for my father, for the composure he'd taught me. I stood silently by the coffin, looking at his face one last time, and promised him I wouldn't let his legacy, our family's legacy, be forgotten. A few days later, my father's lawyer called me to review the will. I sat in a small, stuffy room facing Linda and Jacob. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with a dry voice, read aloud line by line. The Newport mansion where I grew up, where every memory of my mother and father lived, was left to Linda and Jacob. The entire estate, the investment fund, shares, and the multi-million-dollar house belonged to them. And me? I was left with the antique Rolex, the heirloom from my grandfather, the only legacy my father left me. I sat there, stunned, not because of the estate's value, but because of the betrayal I felt. The house where I'd run through the grass, where I'd listened to my father's stories, now belonged to Linda and Jacob, people who always treated me like an outsider. But when the lawyer handed me the small box containing the Rolex, I clutched it tightly, feeling its weight in my hand. The watch was more than an object. It was my final connection to my father, proof of his love. I looked at Linda and Jacob, their eyes cold, almost triumphant. I said nothing, stood up, left the room, and took the Rolex, the only thing I had left of him. Back in Boston, I placed the watch in my desk drawer where I could see it every day. I was grieving not for the estate, but for my father, for the years I'd missed, for the secrets I sensed but couldn't yet uncover. I began to suspect something was amiss with the will, with how Linda and Jacob had acted, but I had no proof, only a heavy feeling that this story was far from over. The days after the funeral passed in a haze. I returned to Boston to my work, but my mind was elsewhere. Every morning I opened the drawer and looked at the Rolex resting quietly in its wooden box, the dull sheen of its steel reflecting the desk lamp. It wasn't just an object, it was my father. The mornings he taught me to fish by the harbor, the times he laughed heartily when I spilled coffee on his shirt. I didn't wear it, I didn't dare. It was too precious, not for its monetary value, but because it was the only thing left of my father, the final thread connecting me to him. But every time I looked at it, a smoldering anger flared within me. Anger at Linda, at Jacob, and at myself for not seeing what was happening. My law office sat on a quiet street corner in Boston, where I worked like a machine, handling cases, drafting contracts, and trying not to let my emotions take over. But the Rolex in the drawer was a relentless reminder. I started taking it out more often, turning it over in my hands, feeling the tiny scratches on its steel case, as if it could whisper my father's secrets to me. One afternoon, as I prepared for a court hearing, my phone rang. It was Jacob. I frowned, my finger hesitating over the screen. Jacob rarely called, and whenever he did, a chill ran down my spine. "Daniel, you doing okay?" Jacob's voice was soft, but I could hear the falseness in it. "I was thinking of swinging by your office this afternoon to catch up. It's been a while." I wanted to refuse, to demand what he was up to, but I only replied curtly, "Fine. I'll be at the office at 4 p.m. I didn't know why I agreed. Maybe because I wanted to look into Jacob's eyes to search for any hint, however small, of what he and Linda were hiding. But that afternoon, the hearing I was handling ran longer than expected, and when I returned to the office, Jacob was gone. A colleague said he'd stopped by, waited about 10 minutes, then left when he didn't see me. "He seemed in a hurry," my colleague shrugged. I nodded, but the unease surged again like an undercurrent pulling me under. I opened the drawer to check on the Rolex. It was still there, resting in its wooden box, the steel glinting softly. I breathed a sigh of relief, but just a few days later, the real nightmare began. That morning, I arrived at the office early to prepare for a client meeting. I opened the drawer, intending to take out the Rolex and look at it as I often did, but the wooden box was empty. My heart stopped. I tore through the drawer, spilling papers onto the desk, checking every corner, but the watch was gone. I stood there, hands trembling, feeling as if I'd just lost a piece of my father. It wasn't possible. I always locked the drawer, always checked it carefully before leaving the office. Who could have taken it? And then, like a bolt of lightning, Jacob's face flashed in my mind. I called Jacob immediately, my voice shaking with rage. "Jacob, what did you do with the watch?" I didn't bother with pleasantries. Jacob responded with a calm, almost surprised tone. "The watch? What are you talking about, Daniel? I don't know anything about it. I just stopped by your office to check in, but you weren't there." I wanted to scream into the phone to force him to confess, but I had no proof. "You sure you didn't lose it?" he asked, and I caught a hint of mockery in his voice. I hung up, unwilling to hear another word. I knew Jacob had taken the watch. My instincts, the same ones that had helped me win countless cases, were screaming that he was involved. Jacob had never been close enough to visit just to check in. He'd never done that in all the years we'd known each other. But call the police? I hesitated. Making a scene could make things worse, especially without clear evidence. I didn't want to look like a paranoid fool, or worse, tarnish my father's name with a family scandal. But I also couldn't let the Rolex go, not just because it was an heirloom, but because it was the last thing my father left me. After sleepless nights, I decided to hire a private investigator named Carl, recommended by a colleague. Carl was a middle-aged man, taciturn, with eyes sharp as razors. "I need you to follow my stepmother and half-brother," I said, handing him information about Linda and Jacob. "They might be involved in a theft. I want to know what they're doing, where they go, who they meet." Carl nodded, jotting down notes quickly, and promised to report back soon. I didn't say much about the Rolex, only that it was an important family item. But as I left Carl's office, I felt a slight relief, as if I'd begun to reclaim some control. A few days later, I met with Mark, my best friend from college. Mark now worked for a security firm, a big guy with an easy smile but a razor-sharp mind. We met at a small cafe in downtown Boston, where the smell of toasted bread and soft jazz music eased some of my tension. I told Mark everything, about my father, the will, the Rolex, and my suspicions about Jacob. Mark listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or frowning. When I got to the part about the watch being stolen, he leaned forward, his eyes lighting up. "Daniel, are you sure Jacob took it?" Mark asked, his tone serious. I nodded. "I don't have proof, but I know him. Jacob didn't just stop by to visit, he wanted something, and the watch is the only thing that matters to me. Mark nodded, deep in thought. Look, I work with places where valuable items change hands. Auction houses, museums, that sort of thing. If Jacob took the watch, he might try to sell it. I'll keep an eye out for you. But don't do anything stupid. If Jacob and Linda are behind this, they won't stop at the watch. Mark's words sent a chill through me. I hadn't thought that far ahead, but he was right. Linda and Jacob had taken the house, my father's estate. The Rolex might just be one piece of their plan. Anger surged again, but this time it was laced with determination. I would get the watch back, not just because it was an heirloom, but because it was my way of protecting what my father left behind. Thanks, Mark, I said, gripping his hand tightly. I need you now, more than ever. As I left the cafe, I felt a flicker of hope, but also a heavier weight than ever before. I knew I was stepping into a dangerous game where my opponents were my own family. But I had no other choice. The Rolex wasn't just an object. It was my promise to my father, proof of his love and legacy. And I wouldn't let anyone take it from me. The days that followed were a blur of half-consciousness. Each morning I opened my desk drawer, staring at the empty space where the Rolex once lay, and the sense of loss surged again, like a wound that never healed. Work at the law office continued, cases, meetings, contracts, but my mind was elsewhere. I checked my phone constantly, waiting for news from Carl, the private investigator I'd hired to track Linda and Jacob. Every time it buzzed, my heart raced, hoping he'd found a clue. But Carl's reports were brief. Linda went shopping. Jacob met with friends, nothing unusual. I began to wonder if I was imagining things, if my grief over losing my father had turned me into a paranoid skeptic. Then one Friday evening, as I sat in my apartment staring out the window with a cold cup of coffee in hand, my phone vibrated. It was Mark. His voice was urgent, a stark contrast to his usual calm. "Daniel, brace yourself," he said, cutting straight to the point. "I just saw Linda and Jacob at the auction house where I work. They brought in a watch to consign, an antique Rolex, exactly like the one you described." My heart stopped. I gripped the phone tightly, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're sure, Mark? Absolutely sure it's my father's?" "I can't swear it's 100%, Mark replied. "But I've worked with antiques long enough to know a Rolex like that isn't easily mistaken. Stainless steel case, black dial, worn leather strap. They requested an appraisal and want it in next week's auction." I took a picture. "I'm sending it to you now." Moments later, my phone pinged with a message. I opened the photo and my blood boiled. It was my father's Rolex, unmistakable. The tiny scratch on the corner of the case, the faint patina of time on the dial. Rage erupted within me, intertwined with pain. Linda and Jacob didn't just take the watch. They were trying to sell it as if it meant nothing more than a handful of cash. "What's your plan?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with concern. I took a deep breath, trying to rein in my emotions. "I don't know yet, but I need to get it back." "Can you help me?" Mark paused for a moment before replying. "I'll keep a close eye on things. The auction is next Wednesday. If you're going to act, you need to move fast. I'll try to stall them, but you'll need solid proof, Daniel. Auction houses don't mess around with this stuff." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "Thanks, Mark. I owe you." I hung up and sank onto the sofa, my mind reeling. Linda and Jacob were trying to sell the Rolex, the last heirloom my father left me, given with all his love and trust. I felt betrayed, not just by them, but by the years I'd let them manipulate me, building a wall between me and my father. But my anger didn't blind me. I knew I needed proof, a plan. I called Carl and told him what Mark had shared. "They took the watch to an auction house," I said, my voice trembling with fury. "I need you to confirm it. Find out what they've done, who they've met, and why they dare do this." Carl agreed, promising to dig deeper. 2 days later, he called back, his voice low and steady. "Daniel, I've got something. Linda and Jacob visited the auction house twice this week. The first time was to consign the watch, the second to meet with an appraiser. I spoke to a staff member there, off the record, of course, and they confirmed the watch was consigned under Linda's name. They don't know anything about you or its origins. But here's the odd part. Jacob was impatient, kept asking when the auction would happen like he needed the money urgently. I gripped the phone, feeling the pieces starting to fall into place. Jacob needed money urgently? Why? The Newport mansion, my father's investment fund, they already had everything. Why risk selling the Rolex? I didn't understand, but one thing was clear. I wouldn't let them get away with it. The watch wasn't just an object. It was my father's legacy, my promise to him. I would take it back no matter the cost. I called Mark back, my voice now steadier than ever. Mark, I need to meet you. We have to make a plan. I want to confront Linda and Jacob, but I need to do it right. Mark agreed to meet me that same evening at the old cafe. When I walked in, Mark was already there, a black coffee in front of him. His expression serious, but with a hint of the playful spark I remembered from our college days. I pulled up a chair, sat down, and got straight to the point. They're trying to sell the Rolex, Mark, the one my father left me. I don't just want it back. I want them to pay. Mark raised an eyebrow, took a sip of his coffee, and nodded slowly. You're playing hardball, huh? All right, but you need to understand, if you make a scene, there's no turning back. Are you ready? I looked into Mark's eyes, a fire of determination surging within me. I'm ready. They took my father, they took the house, and now the watch. I won't let them take anything else. Mark grinned, a mix of concern and approval in his smile. That's the Daniel Prescott I know. All right, here's the deal. The auction is in 3 days on Wednesday. I can get you into the hall without drawing attention. I know how to handle the security team, but what do you want to do once you're there? Confront them head on? Or do you have another plan? I sat back, my mind racing with options. Part of me wanted to go to the pre-auction appraisal, prove the Rolex was mine, and reclaim it quietly. Mark had suggested it. The auction house always verifies the provenance of items before they hit the floor. And if I could provide evidence, they'd have to return the watch. I had the will, my father's signature, and old family photos of him wearing the Rolex. But the idea of a quiet victory didn't satisfy me. Linda and Jacob didn't just take the watch. They'd stolen my father's final years, building a wall between us. They didn't deserve an easy pass. Mark, I said, my voice low but firm, I want to expose the truth. Right there in the auction, in front of everyone, the wealthy, powerful people of Newport. I want Linda and Jacob humiliated with no way to deny it. And I want the police to handle them for theft. Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't object. He nodded as if he'd anticipated my choice. All right, but if you're going that route, you need to be prepared. That auction hall will be full of big players. If you make a scene without proof, they'll side with Linda and Jacob. What do you have? I told Mark about the will, how my father left the Rolex to me, and about Jacob's visit to my office just before the watch disappeared. I don't have direct proof Jacob took it, I admitted. But Carl's tracking them, and you saw them consign the watch. That's enough to start with. Mark nodded, but his eyes remained cautious. You need more than that, Daniel. An accusation won't cut it. You need something undeniable. Evidence they can't talk their way out of. I knew Mark was right, but time was short. Only 3 days until the auction, and I needed to act fast. You can get me into the hall without being noticed, right? I asked. Mark nodded. I know people on the security team. I can get you in as a guest, but you have to stay calm until the right moment. If you're going to expose them, make it flawless. I smiled, though my heart was still heavy. I'll make it work. I promise. The next few days were a race against time. I contacted Carl, asking him to focus on every move Linda and Jacob made. Carl reported that they were frequenting the auction house, meeting with staff and seeming confident about selling the Rolex. They're acting like they've got nothing to worry about, Carl said over the phone, his voice low. But Jacob's jumpy. He keeps looking over his shoulder like he's afraid of being followed. That detail solidified my certainty. They knew the watch was mine, and they were trying to cover their tracks. I prepared as best I could. I made copies of the will and dug up old photos of my father wearing the Rolex and documented every detail about Jacob's visit to my office. I wasn't sure if it would be enough to convince the auction house or the police, but it was all I had. Each night I sat in my apartment staring out at Boston's glowing skyline, imagining the moment I'd confront Linda and Jacob. I pictured their panicked faces, the silence of the auction hall, and the feeling of justice being served. But deep down, I was scared. Scared I'd fail, scared the Rolex and my father's legacy would be lost forever. The night before the auction, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the sofa staring at the ceiling, thinking of my father. I remembered his eyes in his final days, frail but full of love. I remembered his words about the Rolex. "It's not just time, Daniel, it's our family's trust." I clenched my fists, feeling as if my father was somewhere watching me. "I won't let you down," I whispered, unsure if he could hear me. On the day of the auction, I woke before dawn. The apartment was silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock, a constant reminder of time slipping away. I put on a black suit, tied my tie carefully, and checked the stack of papers in my briefcase. Copies of the will, photos of my father, and notes about Jacob. I wasn't sure if they carried enough weight to convince anyone, but they were my only weapons. Driving my father's old Mustang to Newport, my heart pounded, not from fear, but from something fiercer. I was fighting for my father, for the promise I'd made to myself during those long, sleepless nights. The auction house was an elegant old building with marble columns and warm golden lights. Inside, the atmosphere was opulent to the point of suffocation. Men in expensive suits, women adorned with sparkling jewelry, and the hushed murmurs of Newport's elite. Mark was waiting for me at a side entrance where security was checking the guest list. He clapped my shoulder and whispered, "Stay calm, Daniel. You're in. I'll be nearby, ready if anything goes sideways." I nodded, trying to maintain a composed exterior, though a storm raged within me. Mark led me through a backstage corridor where staff bustled about preparing for the auction. I caught glimpses of the items on display, antique paintings, porcelain, glittering jewelry, but my eyes locked onto a small wooden box on an appraisal table. My father's Rolex. I recognized it instantly, even from a distance. The stainless steel case with its tiny scratch at the corner, the glossy black dial, the worn leather strap. My heart raced, but I held myself back, knowing the moment to act hadn't yet arrived. Before the auction began, the house conducted a final verification of the item's authenticity. I stood in a corner, hidden behind a curtain, watching through a narrow gap. An expert, an older man with gold-rimmed glasses, carefully picked up the Rolex, examining every detail under a light. He removed the strap, inspected the dial, then suddenly paused. I saw him frown, pull out a small screwdriver, and carefully pry open a tiny compartment on the back of the watch. My heart stopped. Something was wrong. Then, as if in a dream, a micro SD card fell out of the compartment. The room fell silent, save for a few whispers from nearby staff. The auction director, a middle-aged woman with her hair in a tight bun, approached, her face puzzled. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. The expert shook his head, clearly surprised. "I don't know, ma'am. We should check its contents before proceeding." The director nodded, motioning for a staff member to take the card to the technical team. Mark, standing beside me, whispered, "You see that? Something's off. What do you want me to do?" I clenched my fists, struggling to stay calm. "Wait," I replied, my voice trembling. "If there's something on that card, I want to know what it is before I act." Mark nodded, pulling out his phone to text someone on the security team. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice. What was that card? Why was it in the Rolex? I thought of my father, his pained and regretful eyes in his final days. Had he hidden something, a secret he couldn't voice? A chill ran down my spine, Not from fear, but from the sense that the truth was drawing near, like a wave about to crash and sweep everything away. Mark pulled me from the shadowed corner and led me to a small waiting room where we could hear updates from the technical team. Minutes later, his phone buzzed. He read the message, then looked at me, his eyes alight. "Daniel, they checked the card. There's a video on it. They're preparing to play it for the organizers to ensure transparency. You need to brace yourself. I don't know what's on it, but if it's tied to your father, this could be what you need." Blood rushed to my head, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in the silence. Mark placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "You okay?" "We need a plan, Daniel. If that video proves something, you have to decide how to use it." I nodded, wiping away a stray tear. "I want to be in the main hall. When they play that video, I want to be there, standing in front of Linda and Jacob. I want them to know I've seen everything." Mark looked at me, his gaze a mix of concern and resolve. "All right, I'll get you in. But promise me, Daniel, don't let your emotions take over. This is your shot." I nodded, feeling like a warrior heading into battle. The Rolex, the micro SD card, the video, they were pieces of a puzzle I didn't fully understand. But one thing was certain. The truth was close, and I wouldn't let it slip away. I followed Mark, my heart pounding, ready to face Linda, Jacob, and whatever secrets were about to be revealed. The auction hall was bathed in warm golden light, but the atmosphere was cold, taut, like a violin string about to snap. Rows of red velvet chairs were filled with unfamiliar faces, collectors, Newport's wealthy elite, and the curious gazes of high society. I stood in a shadowed corner near the back of the room, thanks to Mark's arrangements to keep me unnoticed. He stood beside me, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. "They're over there," he whispered, nodding toward the front row. I followed his gaze and my heart tightened. Linda, in an elegant black dress, sat ramrod straight, her face as cold as stone. Beside her was Jacob in a dark blue suit, but I noticed his hands clenching tightly as if trying to hide his nervousness. The auction began as any high-end event would. The director, the middle-aged woman with her hair in a tight bun, introduced each item with a smooth, polished voice. An antique painting, a porcelain vase, a string of pearls, all fetched dizzying bids. I stood there, hands in my pockets, trying to stay calm, but with each passing minute, my breathing grew harder. The Rolex was next, and I knew the moment of truth was approaching. Mark placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Wait for it, Daniel. Don't move until the video plays." Then the moment arrived. The director introduced the Rolex, her voice ringing through the microphone. An antique Rolex, stainless steel case, black dial, original leather strap, an heirloom from the early 20th century. A staff member held up the watch, placing it under the spotlight, and I saw the steel glint, the small scratch on the corner of the case, a mark of time of my father. The crowd murmured, a few raising their bidding paddles, but then the director raised her hand, signaling a pause. "Before we proceed, we need to address an issue," she said, her voice tinged with hesitation. "During the appraisal, we discovered a hidden micro SD card inside the watch. For transparency, we will now play the contents of the video." The hall fell silent. I glanced at Linda and Jacob. Linda maintained her icy composure, but Jacob shifted in his seat, his eyes wide with panic. My heart pounded, threatening to burst from my chest. Mark gripped my arm and whispered, "This is it. Stay calm." The large screen at the front of the hall lit up and my father's image appeared, gaunt, frail, lying in a hospital bed surrounded by tubes and machines. His voice, trembling but clear, echoed through the speakers. "I am Samuel Prescott. If anyone is watching this video, please find my son Daniel Prescott. I don't have much time left." Each word from my father pierced my heart like a dagger. He spoke, his voice weak but resolute, revealing that Linda and Jacob had coerced him into signing the will when he was no longer fully lucid. "They forbade me from contacting Daniel," he said, his eyes glistening with tears. "They kept me like a prisoner in my own home, denying me access to my friends, my lawyer. I tried to reach my son, but I was too weak. Daniel, if you see this video, I'm sorry. I wasn't strong enough to protect you, to protect our legacy. He paused, drawing a labored breath through the ventilator. Please find Daniel. Tell my son the truth. I felt as if the world had crumbled beneath me. Tears streamed down my cheeks, but I didn't wipe them away. Pain, anger, and self-reproach churned in my chest, making it hard to breathe. My father had tried to protect me, to tell me the truth, but I hadn't been there. I'd let work consume me, allowed Linda and Jacob to build a wall between us. I wanted to scream, to run to him, to say I was sorry, that I loved him. But he was gone, and all that remained was his frail voice echoing through the hall, a final testament. The hall was deathly silent, then erupted in whispers. I looked at Linda and Jacob. Linda's face had paled, her hands clutching her purse tightly, while Jacob bowed his head as if trying to hide from the crowd's stares. The director signaled a pause in the auction, her voice trembling. We need to further verify the provenance of this item. We ask for your patience. I couldn't stay still any longer. The anger and pain within me exploded, propelling me out of the shadows. I wiped my tears, took a deep breath, and spoke loudly, my voice echoing through the hall. I am Daniel Prescott. Every eye turned to me, sharp as arrows. That Rolex belonged to my father, Samuel Prescott, and it was left to me in his will. It was stolen by Linda and Jacob Prescott, who are sitting right there. I pointed at them, my voice trembling with rage but steady in resolve. They didn't just take the watch. They stole my father's final years, coerced him into signing a fraudulent will, and now they dare to auction off his legacy. The hall buzzed with murmurs. Linda shot to her feet, her voice shrill. You're lying. You have no proof. Jacob tried to pull her back down, but his eyes were wild with panic like a cornered animal. I stepped closer, locking eyes with them. Proof? That video is proof. My father told the truth. How you kept him from contacting me, how you forced him to sign the will. And this watch, I pointed to the item on the table, is mine. You took it from my office, Jacob. I know you were there. Jacob opened his mouth to deny it, but his voice faltered, incoherent. The crowd's whispers grew louder, some pointing at Linda and Jacob. The director raised her hand, trying to restore order, but I wasn't done. I've called the police, I said, my voice resounding. They're on their way. You'll answer for everything, for theft, for deception, and for what you did to my father. Linda's face went white, her attempts to speak choked off. Jacob's head hung low, his hands trembling. Tears burned my cheeks, but I let them fall. I stood there, facing them, facing the entire hall, feeling as if I'd finally done what my father wanted, protected his legacy, defended the truth. Mark stepped beside me, whispering, You did good, Daniel. Let the police handle the rest. As I looked at the Rolex on the table, its steel glinting as if speaking to me, I felt my father was still here, watching over me. I had kept my promise to him, not just for the watch, but for love, for justice, and for family. The auction hall still buzzed with whispers as the main doors swung open. The sharp sound of police officers' boots echoed on the marble floor, cutting through the stifling silence. 4 officers in dark blue uniforms entered, their steely gazes sweeping the crowd. The auction director stood abruptly, trying to maintain composure, but her voice faltered as she exchanged quick words with an officer. I stood there, my heart pounding, not with fear this time, but with relief. As if the weight of the past months had finally begun to lift. Mark gripped my shoulder and whispered, You did it. I nodded, my eyes fixed on Linda and Jacob. Linda tried to maintain her haughty demeanor, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Jacob was utterly broken. His head hung low, shoulders shaking as if he knew there was no escape. Mrs. Linda Prescott and Mr. Jacob Prescott, one officer said, his voice deep and authoritative. You are under arrest on suspicion of theft and unlawful appropriation of property. Please come with us. Linda opened her mouth to protest, but an officer raised a hand to stop her. You have the right to remain silent, he said, his voice cold as steel. Anything you say can be used against you in court. Jacob stumbled as he was led away, his eyes briefly meeting mine, not with the defiance of before, but with desperation. I felt no pity. They had taken too much, not just the Rolex, but my father's final years. Now they would face the consequences. The director signaled for a staff member to remove the Rolex from the auction table, placing it in a protective case. "This item will be held as evidence," she said, her voice trembling. "The auction will be postponed until this matter is resolved." The crowd began to disperse, their whispers growing louder, but I didn't care. I stepped closer to the table where the staff was sealing the watch. "That's mine," I said, my voice hoarse but resolute. "It belonged to my father, Samuel Prescott, and was left to me." The director looked at me, her eyes a mix of sympathy and uncertainty. "We'll verify, Mr. Prescott, but with that video, I believe you." I turned to see Mark standing near the exit, a faint smile on his lips. "You did great," he said. "Now go home, get some rest. You need it." But I shook my head. "It's not over, Mark. I need to make sure they don't get away. Not just for the watch, but for everything they've done." Mark nodded, as if he understood the storm still raging inside me. "The police asked me to come to the station to give a statement. I brought the copies of the will, the photos of my father wearing the Rolex, and my notes about Jacob's visit to my office. At the station, I met Ellen, a sharp-witted lawyer I knew from my Boston days, her eyes never missing a detail. I told her everything, from my father's illness and Linda's secrecy to the stolen watch and the video on the micro SD card. Ellen listened, jotting down notes quickly, then set her pen down. "Daniel, that video is key evidence. It not only proves the watch is yours, but raises serious questions about the will's validity. If your father was coerced, we can challenge the entire estate." I nodded, a spark of hope cutting through the darkness. "Can you do it?" I asked, my voice low but filled with hope. Ellen smiled, a confident smile. "I'll do everything I can, but brace yourself, this will be a long legal battle." I looked at her, determination surging within me. "I'm ready. For my father." As I left the police station, night had fallen. I drove back to Boston, my mind still reeling from the day's events. The Rolex was being held as evidence for now, but I wasn't worried. I knew it would come back to me. What haunted me was my father's voice in the video, frail but full of love. He'd tried to protect me even when he had no strength left, and I had failed to be there for him. But now, I wouldn't fail to seek justice. The months that followed were an endless string of long days, filled with meetings with Ellen, hours poring over documents and sleepless nights. The trial against Linda and Jacob was scheduled at the Newport courthouse, and I knew it would be my last chance to set everything right. I prepared meticulously, bringing everything I had: the will, photos of my father wearing the Rolex, Carl's testimony about Jacob's actions at my office, and most crucially, the video from the micro SD card, my father's final testament, undeniable proof. On the day of the trial, I entered the courtroom with a heavy but resolute heart. The room was smaller than the auction hall, but the atmosphere was heavier, as if every gaze was passing judgment. Linda and Jacob sat at the defendant's table, their eyes avoiding mine. Linda still clung to her haughty demeanor, but I could see exhaustion etched on her face. Jacob looked haggard, as if the past months had drained his vitality. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Ellen, feeling like I was gearing up for the final battle. The judge, an older man with a stern gaze, called the court to order. Ellen stood, presenting the case with razor-sharp clarity. She described how Linda and Jacob had coerced my father into signing the will when he was in poor health, how they isolated him, and how they stole the Rolex to sell at auction. But the heart of it all was the video. When Ellen requested it be played, the courtroom fell silent. My father's image appeared again, his frail voice echoing through the speakers. "I am Samuel Prescott. Please find my son Daniel Prescott." I bowed my head, tears welling up again. Each word from my father was a dagger, but also a reminder of why I was here. Ellen turned to me, placed a hand on my shoulder, and whispered, "You okay?" I nodded, wiping my tears quickly. "Keep going," I said, "for my father." When the video ended, Ellen presented the additional evidence: Carl's testimony, the photos of the Rolex and the original will clearly stating the watch was left to me. She argued that the will distributing the estate to Linda and Jacob was invalid, as my father had been coerced while not of sound mind. Linda and Jacob's lawyer tried to counter, claiming my father signed willingly and that the video lacked legal weight. But the judge frowned, clearly unconvinced. After 3 grueling days, the verdict was delivered. The judge declared the previous will invalid due to clear evidence of coercion. Linda and Jacob were convicted of theft and unlawful coercion in creating the will. The Newport mansion, the investment fund, and all of my father's assets were recognized as rightfully mine, the legal heir. The Rolex, held as evidence throughout the process, was finally returned to me. Holding the watch in my hands, I felt as if my father were standing beside me, smiling. I had done it, not only reclaimed his legacy but restored justice for him. Linda and Jacob left the courtroom in silence, their eyes reflecting only defeat. I felt no satisfaction, only relief, as if I had finally fulfilled my promise to my father. I left the courtroom and stepped into the August sunlight of Newport, where the salty scent of Narragansett Bay mingled with the fragrance of nearby gardens. The Rolex rested in my suit pocket, heavy but warm, as if reminding me that my father was still out there watching over me. I drove the old Mustang back to the mansion, the home where I grew up, filled with my mother's laughter and my father's stories, now rightfully mine again. As I walked through the oak doors, I felt the breath of the past, as if the house itself were welcoming me home. I stood in the living room where sunlight streamed through large windows, glinting off the polished wood floor. On the fireplace mantel I placed the Rolex, not in its box but free, a symbol of what I had fought to preserve. I looked at it, its steel gleaming in the sunlight, and remembered my father's words in the video. Don't let them take it. I did it, Dad. Not just the watch, not just the house, but the truth. The truth about your love, about our family's legacy. In the days that followed, I began to rebuild my life. The mansion was more than a house. It was a responsibility, a reminder of what my father had left behind. I didn't want to sell it, didn't want to turn his legacy into money. But I also didn't want it to be just a place to live where memories of my father would gather dust. I wanted it to live, to mean something, the way my father always lived for family and the values he held dear. An idea began to take shape, to transform the mansion into the heart of a larger project, something my father would be proud of. I contacted Ellen, my lawyer, and shared the idea. I want to establish a scholarship fund in my father's name, the Samuel Prescott Foundation, I said, my voice brimming with determination. The mansion will be its headquarters, a place for fundraising events where disadvantaged kids from Newport can come, learn, and dream. I want to help them the way my father always believed in me. Ellen smiled and nodded. That's a wonderful idea, Daniel. Your father would be proud. We set to work, transforming the mansion into an open space for community events, exhibitions, and gatherings to support the foundation. Each year, the fund would award scholarships to underprivileged students in Newport, kids like the ones who ran along the cobblestone streets as I once did, dreaming but lacking opportunity. I returned to Boston, but I was no longer the same Daniel Prescott. My work as a lawyer continued, but I didn't let it consume me anymore. I made time to remember my father, my mother, and what truly mattered. Each morning I wore the Rolex, not to show off, but because it was a part of me, a part of my father, my grandfather, the Prescott family. It reminded me that time is precious, that family is not just blood, but what you fight to protect. One afternoon, I sat on the lawn behind the mansion, looking out at the bay. The breeze carried the scent of salt, and I heard the waves crashing like my father's whispers. I thought about the journey, from the days I was lost in work, missing my father, to the moment I confronted Linda and Jacob and finally reclaiming what was mine. I learned that justice isn't just about triumphing over others, it's about preserving what you love, living true to what your parents taught you. If I could offer anyone advice, it would be this: cherish your loved ones while they're still with you. Don't let work, money, or fleeting things pull you away. Listen, be there, and fight for what's right. My father left me the Rolex not to keep it locked in a box, but to live with it. To live with trust, love, and the resolve of the Prescott family. I stood up, fastened the Rolex on my wrist, feeling its weight like a promise. I walked back into the house, ready for a new chapter of my life, one where I was not just Daniel Prescott, the lawyer, but Daniel Prescott, the son of Samuel, the keeper of our family's legacy. My father was right. Money is just a tool. Family, justice, and love. Those are the things that endure.